Hello, welcome back to our channel. Spencer Orlowski, coach at the Argument Institute, meeting today with Aidan Etkin. Aidan, would you like to introduce yourself?
For sure. I'm also a coach at the Argument Institute, formerly worked with Break Debate, primarily specializing in K arguments and answering K arguments. I also worked with Berkeley Preparatory School in policy, who, first coaches poll, quarters TOC, K team, and that's pretty much it.
Okay, how'd the TOC go? What happened? Why'd they lose? I thought they were going to win. Everyone told me they were going to win, you know?
Yeah, I mean, they wanted my heart, but I don't know.
That's
I
so
feel like
nice.
we definitely just approached the TOC the wrong way in the
Okay.
sense that we were kind of over investing in what we were already good at and focusing on like the technical minutia of arguments that we were winning every single round anyway. And kind of because of that, sacrificed a lot of the more soft skills that are necessary to do really well. Specifically the quarters round. I mean, I think we had the winning strategy coming into it. It's just one, there's a lot of nerves, obviously, especially because fun fact about RV, lost quarters for the 2 years in a row before that. So there's like
The
kind of something
mental
special
block
about the round.
is real. Yeah, the mental block is
Yeah. And the second issue, I think, is that we're kind of too technical in that debate, if that makes sense.
yeah,
And
that happens a lot. Yeah. It takes
yeah,
a
it's
perfect
like
judge for you to win it, you know?
yeah, but I mean, we learn from those mistakes, and at the very least, it's good to know why something went wrong than just be utterly lost and confused. So that's always a positive. But I think that it's kind of ironic to say, but debate's definitely more than winning or losing, and they came a really long way, and I'm content no matter how they did, unless
I
they
think
didn't
it,
break.
dude, it's so true. I definitely feel like that when I was younger, people would tell me that all the time. Like I remember being at Emory at like the opening ceremony, I don't know, my junior, senior year, and they were all like, it's not about the trophies. The trophies are gonna tarnish, you know. All you'll remember is the memories. You'll never remember the judge who dropped you. And for like 8 years, I was like, these people are just wrong, you know? Like I
Yeah.
remember every judge who dropped me. And yeah, I have to say, 20 years later, yeah, I still remember the friends I was there with. Could not tell you the topics or what the rounds were about. No, it's definitely true. It's really cool seeing kids grow up like that. That's awesome. So tell me a little bit about your background. I know you're in LD, but from what I understand, you didn't debate much in high school. You did a little policy. What was that like?
Yeah, so I went to like a small public school in New York, doing policy. Never really touched LD. I originally thought like Phil, tricks, etc. was really silly, which I've kind of changed my mind on. But we can kind of delve into that a little bit later.
Yeah, yeah,
I did read K arguments primarily, but not the type that I'm known for now. In fact, I thought that framework as like an argument in and of itself didn't make much sense to me. I was more of a links to the plan type of guy. I went for the cap K pretty much every single round, ever negating, whether
yeah.
versus a KF or a PulseF. And the most I've spent on framework was concede their interp, the link is to the plan. Albeit I didn't really debate too much. So that might have affected a lot of like my thoughts on arguments, my biases, etc. And I mean, most of how I learned debate was just talking to people about it. So especially during like when I debated, when everything was online, mid COVID, they were just
Yeah.
like these enclaves, right? Like Discord servers hosting
You
tournaments,
say Discord
everyone,
blew up. Yeah.
yeah, ganged up in voice chats, and I would just join those and think a lot, and talk a lot about the activity. And I think that kind of, got me interested and made me start liking it. And I had like a crave to keep doing it after I graduated, because I never really got to compete much myself. So I thought,
Right.
why
It's
not live
hard to give up on
vicariously?
too. It's like I had a student once describe it as like the best strategy game ever made with like infinite possible opportunities, just like the most deep video game you'll ever try. No, I absolutely agree. That's interesting. Okay, cool. So you didn't debate much, but why'd you end up working in LD? What drew you to LD?
So, I mean, realistically, it's because so I was coached in high school my senior year primarily by Kumi or Kumail Zaidi, who was
Oh, I
big in
love it.
LD.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And I mean, I'm obviously very grateful. He basically defined debate for me, and I have a lot of his takes
That's
had
lucky because you're the
built
only
on.
person that I gave a 30 to in like a tech round for like a good 5 year period. He closed his laptop before a 2 hour on Maoism versus Deleuze. And I was just like so impressed by this like the depth of all the examples while like actually looking at me. Yeah. No, very, very impressive. Like good at the fundamentals and just like the actually knowing
Yeah,
stuff. You don't see
I
a lot.
definitely think that debaters like him have kind of faded out in the sense that no one's really as knowledgeable about the arguments they read anymore. Like there's no like depth to their speeches. They don't, like you said, draw on a lot of examples. They don't really know the history of what they're talking about. It's more so just like, here's an argument. It's meant to access a certain
Here's
win
my chat
condition, and that's like
GPT
all I need to
2.0.
do. Yeah, like
Yeah.
like literally, they just say
Literally,
words.
no, no, I know, yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
until the judges vote for them, which I think, that's actually not necessarily bad, but it is something that I kind of think I miss, at least, or not miss because I never got to judge it technically, but
Yeah.
something that I wish I did get to judge and like watch and kind of learn from these debates, right? Because you can go after judging around and talk to your friends or like go to a social justice class and be like, well, here's all these examples. How do I know about them? I heard them in a 2 and R. But you can't really do that with like framework or like the case turn or a bunch of
Right.
other esoteric like debate specific things that are just all of these truncations with like reference to a critical argument somewhere in between.
I hope it's a passing reference to it, right?
Yeah.
No, that's absolutely true. Yeah, I definitely agree. I mean, I remember I learned about Huey Newton because of a cat tale once. Yeah, and it's something. Yeah, you go explore it, you read more, you actually like learn about the world. That is something I do. I tend, I talk a lot about theory. Of course, I work with Scopa, so delving into the differences between the norm setting model and like in-ground abuse, and if you specified that in the constructive, right? Like obviously very tangentially related to like education in the real world. But yeah, I tend to agree with you. A lot of the old school K debaters with like real alternatives that,
Hmm.
they were explaining why they resolved the AF. Yeah, definitely a very educational approach. And those people, they always tend to do really cool things, right? Because the ability to like grapple with that kind of literature in what, when you're 15, 16, it definitely bodes well for your future in terms of your reading skills, right? Cool. So,
Yeah.
kind of along that same vein, are there any interesting trends you're seeing in LD that are either, concerning or awesome, right? Either way, I mean, don't need to be negative.
Yeah, for sure. I think that there's two primary trends, not only in LD, but also in policy. The first is that K debates, specifically on the framework front, AF and neg, are moving away from being about models. Like teams no longer sketch out what a year of debate looks like under the counter interpretation. They no longer talk about, like a very sophisticated story of how the AF explodes limits, grounds, etc. It's more so just like the affirmative gets up and says, you read T, that was violent in this round. Negative gets up and says, your ballot does nothing, you can only solve fairness in this round. And there's not a lot of depth to these debates, right? It's like pretty narrow and insular, revolves around these single issues. And it's kind of self-defeating because the point of interpretations is to talk about, what that would look like, to set a norm, if you will, for what future rounds, like how they should take place, which we don't really get here when, negative teams or affirmative teams either concede or contest the premise that what the judge does in this round affects future ones.
Right.
And then the second trend that I've noticed in LD is, we kind of touched upon this already, but Ks are just becoming like, glorified theory arguments, right? Like you mentioned, old K debaters, it's like a critical counterplan and a disad, right? The link turns
Really
case,
was.
it outweighs, it's to the plan, the alternative is solvent more or less. But in these framework rounds, it's literally just like a link as a violation. Interpretation, debaters may not be racist. Violation, you defended the state, settler colonialism is true. Standards, K framework top down, right?
Yeah.
And I mean, I'm obviously kind of guilty of this because this
Who
is
isn't? Who
something
isn't?
that,
We'll make whatever argument
um,
we can, right?
yeah, I'm known for. But I definitely think that it's almost like strategic to revert back to the old argumentative style because people just forgot how to answer them, right? Like no one has debated this. Everyone is out of the meta or like rather, like the old meta can become the new one because no one remembers how to respond to it.
Yeah.
Um, so
No,
there's
dude, give
definitely
us a
room for
year.
exploration
Everyone's
there.
gonna forget about Baudrillard in a year. We'll just like beat
Mhm.
everyone once again on Baudrillard. No, it does go in these like weird 3 year cycles. No, I tend to agree with you. So are you suggesting then that like alt solves case is gonna be a little bit more of a pivot in the next year or two, you think?
So I think it's kind of hard to say because there needs to be a reason why people stop making those arguments, right? It's not like you wake up one day and you're like, yeah, I think
Yeah.
I'll just change things up for the sake of it. In my personal opinion, structurally, I think that the type of tuner that goes for that argument is really, really hard to win if the AF team knows what it's doing and makes the right arguments. And I'm of the inverse opinion when it comes to framework that structurally, if the 2NR like manages to prove a link argument, I don't think like plain focus is like technically debated evenly a winning 2AR, especially in LD where there's like a 3 to 6 skew. That being said, this presumes that everyone who's giving 1ARs is perfect, which kind of is an assumption that I would challenge because again, everyone just forgot like what checklist to tick off when it comes to responding to Ks like that. And sometimes people just forget to make those arguments. So what I think will happen or should happen at the very least is people should have more diverse 1NC shells, right? That you can either go for a framework style 2NR or alt solves case, link turns and outweighs it 2NR. And then you
Yeah.
can like pick and choose based on the 1AR, right? Essentially, what you can do, and this is what I recommended to Berkeley in some instances, is you should have like a few arguments in your head, and you're like, okay, the 1AR says 2 or 3 of these, I cannot go for this 2NR because it's just like the 2AR just kills me, right? The 2AR only needs these 2 to 3 things. If they respond it, there's no point trying to like, out tech them when you're just like structurally disadvantaged in terms of like, what argument is quote unquote winning or losing. You should just
Right. Right.
pivot to the other strategy. But I think that the issue now is that people don't have that pivot, right? Like if you go on the wiki and you look at most of these K1NCs, the alternative is like the most massive nothing burger ever. Vote
Dude,
negative to reject
they're two
racism.
cards. They're two
Like
cards, sometimes one
yeah.
card. Yeah, it's wild seeing a 6 minute 2 and R on a K that was maybe 30 seconds in the one NC, you know? Yeah.
Mhm.
So what would that look like from your perspective? What would like a more strategic one NC K look like?
Well, I think it mostly has to do with the nature of the link argument and the nature of the like alternative, right? So, perfect example, if you want to have an option where the 2NR goes for alt solves case, for instance, you need an alternative card that, solves case, or at the very least
The
is defending
context of
some
the app. Yeah, yeah.
yeah, like something material. If it's about the 1AC, that's nice. If it isn't, you could read a card that says, settler colonialism is the root cause of AF impact. Alt solves settler colonialism. Connect the dots. The alt
At
is able to
least give
solve the
us that. Yeah,
case.
I think that's just like
Yeah,
a bare minimum research burden for for somebody engaging. Yeah, you need something that describes the AF, why we make it worse, and why you fix that. Like, come on, it's two
I also
cards.
think specifically in LD, the 1NC certainly needs to telegraph this argument. And what I mean by that is like if you read a card, let's say, the stereotypical set call alt, just to use a very common example,
Yeah,
grande, right? Refusal. All that card really says is, we need global decolonial movements against settler colonialism and need to deconstruct it.
yeah.
Sure, there's nothing in that card that applies, what that alternative would materialize as in the context of the 1EC, explains how it resolves app specific internal links,
Yeah.
or anything of that nature. So to me, at least as a judge, when, all the 1NC does is read that card in and of itself and tag it, vote negative for refusal, and then Tunar says they dropped alt solves case, I'm just like, where was that argument in the 1NC? Like I'm super persuaded by a 2AR that just calls them out on that bullshit. But I think the solution to that is, making it very, very clear in the 1NC that at the very least the alt solves case at least say the lines, or even better, have like a warrant that you can then explode into 2NR. And I
So
also
where would
think
you put that? Where would you put that? Would you put that in the tag of the
yes,
alternative? Would you put it in underview? Would you read it on the case debate? Where would you think that's best?
I would certainly read it in the tag of the alternative. So
Yeah, I
actually,
would
I mean,
too. Yeah.
that's like assuming that it's a card like Grande. But I think the most optimal version of the 1NC is you just read your generic alt card, and then you have another card after that that says solves case, and then
Yeah.
either you can like read a root cause card like I mentioned before, which is just like settler colonialism is the root cause of their impacts, or even more ideal, you have a card that's about what the alternative would look like historically or empirically or I guess prescriptively in the context of AF scenarios applied to them, right? For
Yeah, and
instance,
so
like,
that's something I'm very passionate about is cutting an additional alternative card
yeah,
for whatever
yeah.
the topic is. Like I don't think you're done with just a link card on any given K. No, I tend to agree with that. That makes a lot of sense to me. There's
Hmm.
a reason why I'm like so skeptical of the K framework trend because I'm just like that to me is like it's only half the battle to learn the
Yeah.
problem, right? Like I want a somewhat of a solution, right? Like this
Mhm.
literature may be pushing me in that direction in some way. Okay, interesting. Sorry, what were you saying? I feel like I cut you off. My bad.
Oh, no, it's all good. I was going to give an example. I think that probably the best instance where at least me personally, I've done something like this is on the living wage topic. I cut a K, like settler economics, it was called. And we had this like, very specific alternative card, not only to like the nature of affirmatives about fiscal redistribution or at the very least fiscal policy, but it was also, the exact opposite of our links, right? We had a link argument that said like, economic like 1AC's economic view is wrong and racist. It like presumes everyone's a rational actor. This isn't true. And then the alternative, like solvency card, the second one, was like this really specific, laundry list of like how non-utilitarian, non sort of like monetary economic relationships look like, why they're non-hierarchical, why they're non-exploitative, why they don't reproduce like, the colonial transactional relationships that like Western epistemologies when it comes to economics do. So I just think stuff like that is just like really, really persuasive, obviously, because specificity is good. No one disagrees on
It's
that.
good 100%
But
every time,
yeah.
every topic, doesn't matter. Specificity is good. Yeah.
And two, I think that it allows you to kind of articulate your alternative in a more narrow way, which basically lets you like fly swat all of like the random 1AR disads they'll read, right? Because if you have like a really, really, really big alternative, then sure, you're able to solve for more things, but you're also susceptible to more offense, right? They get like, the military has F-17s and tanks disad. Whereas if you make the K like kind of single issue, and what I mean by that is like you critique a very specific portion of the AF and you have an alternative that solves a very specific portion of the AF, then you force them into a debate that they're not ready for. And you can just, dodge every generic and common card they read in the 1AR. Tanks, alternative isn't that, it's specific about resolving the link argument and spills over to case. And that kind of makes the 2ER really, really, really hard because, you have to battle against 2NR reclarification. You have to essentially, in 3 minutes, win that the alternative is larger than the 2NR's claimed it was, and then win offense to that larger alternative, whereas you can just cut out the middleman if the alt is something like generic and large.
Yeah. Yeah. I tend to agree. I think that's very insightful. I think you and I very much see K debate very similarly.
Hmm.
Interesting. So, um, yeah, the money topic's a great example. We read the like tech management K of money, and then the alternative is here's what an alternative monetary system would look like, right?
Hmm.
Definitely, I think that is where a lot of the heart of the kind of educational value of a lot of this comes from. And also just like tend to agree with you strategically. Like, give us as many options as we want. So, what do you think you want to see more of this next year from the community? What do you think would make you happy?
I mean, I would, again, I feel like I've touched upon this already. I'd like to see a return to substantive K debate. Um, and I don't only mean this in the sense that I want to see a 2NR that, debates the AF, like, whoa. But I also kind of want to see K debaters with more conviction. And what I mean by that is like, okay, like you can, have like on YouTube a playlist of every single K round that transpired this year. And I
Yeah.
promise you that 99.99% of them, you go and you watch them and you listen to the 2NR and you're like, okay, like obviously this 2NR is very technical. It's making all the right arguments, but like this is such like, come on, bro. Like
Yeah,
you're
yeah.
like, like the 2NR is like, they were racist. This racism is like psychically detrimental. I'm about to have a heart attack or, it's like stressing me out. And then it just like, 5 points the entire framework debate and then goes and, line by lines everything to oblivion, which is like, I think this is good, obviously, but like you can't help but roll your eyes. But if
I
you
mean,
look at
yeah, I
like,
don't regularly see a discussion of the advantage, the mechanism, like what actually happened with the app, how it tangibly makes the world worse in the context of the resolution. Yeah, it is usually you defended the state or you said we shouldn't like have extinction. Yeah, that's pretty
yeah,
much it.
exactly. And it's just like, like a lot of like you mentioned this earlier as well, like old K debate, it was super like nuanced, right? You had like Louisville, they analogized NATO withdrawal to like racism in debate. Kumi's a good example. All of his Ks were very topic relevant and substantive as well. And like when you listen to their 2NRs, you can feel passion. They care about their arguments. They
That's
actually
one of the
believe what they're
things I
saying.
miss. Yeah, there is a
Um,
passion there. Yeah.
yeah, and then if you look at like current debaters in high school, like no one believes that fiat is racist. No one believes that like, whatever dropped link is generally something that the AF did that's problematic. They just, do it to win, which again, like yes, this is debate, but I'm kind of like, I want to see what I missed out on in terms of like a
I guess
resurgence
that,
of
so
like
this is
pure K debate.
a bit of a side question. Do you think that the disad and the K can contradict each other, like as a human?
Or what do you mean as a human?
Like, would you be fine with somebody reading set call and a hedge disad together?
I think that's unstrategic because it's less
Yeah,
that it's like, oh, like it's like a perf con type thing. It's more so that it's just like a double turn, right? Like, I feel like if I was the
straight up
AF
double.
team,
Yeah.
yeah, like I would just concede that hedge is good. I would, either link turn or no link to disadd, and then I would like read an internal link between the alternative and hedge collapse, and they basically saved me like however long it took them to read the impact. And they can't contest
That's
the
one of
premise
my
of the
pet
claim.
peeves is the seven off where the K is one of them and links to the three other ones, the disad, the counter. It's too
I
much
think
for me.
that
Let's get a
the
compelling
biggest
threat.
skill that debaters right now are missing is the ability to analyze arguments across flows and kind of use that to their advantage, right? Like debaters are super like single issue right now. They treat every flow as its own separate thing and answer the arguments as they appear almost like in a vacuum. But, I'm literally judging like these, aforementioned seven off one and C's. And I'm like, okay, well, these two things double turn themselves. These three things are direct contradictions with another. This was like, killed in cross X. And then I'm like, okay, this is such a free win. This one here is about to clap them. And the one here gets up and
And
just like
just
it treats
go
it
for
like
the
a regular one and
pre-written
C.
thing.
They just read the block straight down without making any smart concessions
Any
or,
indirect.
pointing out any of these issues. And that's just like, it's bad for your ethos. It's obviously not strategic, which, is counterintuitive to
Yeah.
winning. And it's just like, it's frustrating for the judge. I'm just like sitting there, like, what are you doing?
How do you think kids get better at that? Because I mean, I agree. I think the court vision is non-existent in this generation, and I mean, I don't know if I'm just getting older and it's more obvious to me. I don't know if it's this is a skill I just happen to be good at, right? It was very similar to Swickle, and that like just like I know the one issue I need to win, I'm gonna find it, right? I don't know. That was a skill I had. So how do you think kids can get better at this, like at paying attention in the bigger picture?
Yeah, I think there's two ways to improve it. I think the first has to do with how they approach debate. They need to think about arguments more mechanically. What I mean by that is when you look at an argument, you can't just think of it in terms of its content, like what are they saying, but also you have to think about its implication. Why are they saying this thing? What win condition does it help them reach? And when you break arguments down, using that structure, then how like different routes to different win conditions might interact, might obstruct each other, etc. And I think the second thing, a more pragmatic way to train the skill is to judge rounds. Because
Yep.
the reason I think that as people get older, it's easier to see what's the most strategic option or their strategic vision, quote unquote, improves, is because they actually watch rounds. When you debate, you're like super hyper focused on winning. You're not really, like looking at it from an outsider's perspective.
You
It
always
kind of
think you're
like
right too. You
exactly,
always
exactly,
right on the thing
right?
you went for. Anyone who's good at debate thinks they're right. That's just like the
Hmm.
nature of that type of person, right? Yeah, and
Yeah.
so it is so hard for you to look out and see how much closer the rounds are and like how irresolved or I guess unresolved a lot of the like clash points really
Hmm.
are. Yeah.
Hmm.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
interesting.
And I
We're
think
actually
that,
doing at camp, we're trying to kind of remedy this. We have a lot of staff at camp this year, and a lot of people who are really good at debate, and so yeah, we're gonna have a ton of like staff debates. Like they're gonna be like relatively prepared, right? But we're really excited for that. I think having the kids, adjudicate some really high level rounds where they have to like look a coach in the eye and explain why they dropped them. I think that's gonna teach them like a lot of responsibility for the flow, right? And like seeing how much easier it could be if they just had a short overview or just like resolved one issue, gave one example, right? So anything else you think kids could focus on to try to improve that kind of round vision?
yeah, I mean, I think another thing is talking about debate is very helpful. There's this misconception, I think, across the community that in order to improve at debate, you have to debate. But that kind of takes for granted what a debate actually is. Like, we can, essentially simulate a round, except instead of being confined to speech times, it's just, back and forth, play it by ear. And instead of having the spread, we can talk. Right. So when you
Yeah.
talk about debate, you're just debating under a different rule set, kind of. But it still helps you with all the same things. It teaches you how to generate arguments. It teaches you kind of like working backwards. what an argument is supposed to accomplish. And that kind
Right.
of like wires your brain in a certain way. If I talk about like I talk about K framework, obviously a lot, right? And I think about it a lot. And
Yeah.
that has helped me like be super, super fast at processing arguments, judging, and writing them because it's like a solved puzzle, right? I don't have to
Right.
think about how like two things interact in real time. I know the answer already, but I didn't always. I had to come to that solution through, iteration, through discussion, and I also change my mind all the time. And this, I think, is really helpful in round as well, because if you know every argument being made, now with your 4 minutes of measly prep time, you're not thinking about like, what the hell did they just say? Like, what is this argument?
Yeah.
More so, you're like, okay, here's what they said. I know the answer. I yelled at my friend about it a week ago and I was totally right, and you could just make it, right? So
Yeah, I
you
mean,
need
prep
to
time should
think.
literally just be for organizing your thoughts. If you're actually generating arguments, you are behind. Like I 100% agree. That is something that needs to happen before. And my wife and I used to do that constantly, every single day, constantly talking about debate. There's
Hmm,
no
hmm.
diss ad we didn't, we did policy style debate, right? So there was no diss ad we didn't know the answer to before, the round happened. Because I say this all the time. If you're not willing to work on debate every day or talk about debate, somebody is, and they're just going to be better at it than you. Yeah, no, I
Hmm.
mean, I think Scope and I talk about this a lot too, like how lucky we are that we get to just sit there and just yap about debate all day. Like I think both of us have kind of like, come together a little bit in terms of our beliefs as a result of it. Yeah, I mean, you just have those back and forths. One thing I would suggest to people is kind of thinking about what you want the RFD to be, right? And then just kind of working your way backwards from there. And then, kind of evaluating to yourself, how much time does it take to get this path to the ballot? How much time does it take for this path, right? And I think that kind of comparing all of these different paths and envisioning, what they could be, pause around your either judging or watching, or even when you were in, and then like kind of analyze what the potential paths are. And just starting to think like that to me is really helpful. I definitely I get spoiled sometimes working with kids who already have that kind of strategic vision. But it's definitely a fun thing to work on. Yeah. Do you have any more thoughts on that, or you want to
Yeah,
move
I
on?
was just gonna add that I think that this is single-handedly the most important skill in debate, and it's the difference between reaching octos and quarters at best and winning tournaments, right? A lot of debaters have an issue where they, one, are way too implicit with the way they explain arguments. They expect judges to just connect dots for them, even though that like, not everyone thinks about debate the same way. They're not very clear about the implication of their argument. They say what
Especially with
something
the
is,
fairness
not why it
paradox.
matters. Oh yeah, I feel like the
It's
issue
like
there,
3 words done. Like,
yeah, I feel like the issue there is that like they kind of take advantage of how entrenched that argument has become, in like the minds of everyone in the community. And their philosophy is just that, like, dude, it's the fairness paradox. Everyone knows the
yeah, come
fairness
on.
paradox.
Yeah.
And no judge wants to give an RFD that's like, the fairness paradox, like I don't know the warrant. And the debater's like, oh my God, I have to strike this guy, he's stupid.
Yeah.
But the second thing I think, and this is also something that might help debaters improve their strategic vision, is the top, like you said, the top of every single 2NR, and like this is how I define judge instruction, should be what you want the RFD to sound like. And I'm actually amazed that people don't do it because everyone has the ability to do judge instruction. And the proof of that
Right.
is when kids lose a round, or not even lose, but before the kids get the ballot, what's the first thing they do? They go to Discord, they tell their friends, okay, my round just finished. Everyone's like, what happened? Did you win? Did you lose? And the first thing the kid does is like, well, the 1AR said this, the 2NR replied that way, the 2AR said that. I think I'm going to win for these reasons. Like, I'm going to win because, the disad turned case faster than
Imagine if
case
that
turned
was the
disad.
overview.
Yes. So
GG.
they
Like,
exactly,
that's,
right? Like, why are you doing this after the round in Discord? Why is it not at the top of your speech? You know how to do it. Just start doing it and watch the ballots come in, right?
and when you judge rounds, you're practicing doing that. You're giving an RFD. That RFD, yeah, throw that at the top of your 2AR, GG. It's so like that. It's funny teaching overviews. Obviously, I do most of that with like younger public forum students because I think that's where it's like especially super relevant because there's so many lay
Hmm.
judges and we're resolving like 5 disads essentially at the same time. So yeah, obviously like these overviews are super essential. Yeah, and I do kind of take for granted how easy it is to synthesize rounds when you've judged 1,000 rounds. So like, yeah, of course, like you can explain that efficiently. Yeah, but I think kids practicing doing that over and over again, and forcing them to give those RFDs. Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a really important skill. So
Yeah.
what was your favorite position you've worked on the past few years? I know there was
So,
an app you cut that I really liked on
mhm,
what was it, wealth tax?
the Polygraph.
Yeah, I like that one.
Yeah, so I mean, it's a little bit hard of a question to answer because a
Mhm.
notable characteristic of, my approach to debate, which is very framework, almost like theory heavy, is I never really worked on positions as much as I did just like develop arguments on the framework debate. And I think the proof of that is, any round with Berkeley Preparatory School, at the TOC specifically, if they're recorded, you go and you watch that round. I will give $100 to anyone who can spot a moment in the 2NC where the name of a 1NC author is referenced, right?
Yeah.
And what I'm trying to say here is that the 1NC is just like a bunch of words and it gets lost. 2NC gets up and is like, framework, here's like 5 links to, like affirming the topic, and, like some other like random
Yeah.
stuff, that's just like very technically easy to win or like hard for the 1ER to respond to. So I'm kind of gonna like twist your question a little bit. I don't think I have a favorite position per se, but I definitely have a favorite framework argument that I worked on. I
Okay.
think it has to be the golden rule. And, that might ring a bell to a lot of
Ahead.
people. And I think the reason I'm so proud of this argument is because it's been a year since people have been saying it in LD and policy, and no one knows what it actually says. Everyone
Okay.
thinks it's, like a deontological argument that says you should, reject racism just because racism is bad. Other people think, it's like a models type argument that judges should act like their ballot, sets a model because, it's like the 2NR will call your ballot a drop in the bucket. There's an ocean in front of you. Here's like laundry list of debate specific examples of how individual decisions have transformed activity. We went from like parametricized plans, to disclosure to all of these other things, blah, 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 blah. Right. Neither
Yeah.
of these are what the golden rule actually says. And that makes it
Okay.
like very strategic because when the 1ER reads non-responsive arguments, because again, they've like misidentified what you said, that gives you a massive advantage. So
Yeah.
I can't go too much in depth to what it says because it will certainly be making a resurgence. But I think
Okay.
that what I can say about the golden rule is it's almost like, you know, it uses the logic of why the ballot solves fairness against them. So TLDR, right? The reason for
Yeah.
why the ballot solves fairness, what framework teams say it is because it refuses to punish debaters for being unprepared to debate unpredictable advocacies, right? It's reverse causal. Unfairness is not manifest, just because a K is red. It manifests when a team is punished, for not being able to engage the K substantively. And the golden rule kind of hijacks that logic. It says that even though there's like, this kind of dormant racism in the round, that racism isn't actually felt or that racism doesn't materialize until after, you kind of refuse to punish teams for racist behavior
Refuse for
because
the
it sends the
punishment. Yeah.
signal that there's no recourse for racism in all of debate that, amplifies the effects of the actual racism that occurred. It makes minority students exhausted because they essentially, watch the affirmative team, let's say you're negative, get like a hall pass to say whatever they want, because the ballot will never be used to discourage, unethical or racist behavior. So I'm like very, very proud of that argument because I think it, kind of gets us a lot on the framework debate, which is ballot solvency. In my opinion, one of the hardest things for the 200 to win.
Yeah, I guess I don't understand how them saying norm setting doesn't just like end that debate personally. I'm like, I don't know. If they're going for norm setting on T, like, and they
Mhm.
always like it seems like it proves it. So where'd the name come from? The golden rule name.
The golden rule, I mean, it's because like the tag is golden rule, and like the first line is like you should unconditionally reject racialized practices. So that's like the golden rule is to, never reward racism, always reject it. Um, but I don't think I came up with the name. I basically just like, originally I think Michael actually came up with the original golden rule, which was like the examples that I gave you, the one about like acting like your ballot solves.
Yeah.
And then, after a few months, I kind of kept tweaking it and tweaking it and tweaking it. And I eventually arrived at like the golden rule that we say now.
Okay. Interesting. So what was your favorite like topical argument you've worked on?
Oh, sure. I mean, didn't really do much of that in policy.
Something that you learned about.
Yeah, in LD, I think the ocean colonialism K I was pretty smart at. Oh, actually no, it's the settler economics K for sure. I'm
Okay.
I'm happy with that argument for two reasons. One, because it kind of it went full circle a little bit, accomplished that like link to the plan type strategy insofar as like the thesis of the K about economic rationality was essentially like a presumption trigger. It was if the 1EC's theory of economics is wrong, then every prediction they've made reliant on that theory by nature is also wrong. Vote not on presumption. By the way, they're also racist
I
because,
guess
it's
back to
settler
what you were saying.
economics.
That's why it's
Yeah.
so important to like have a specific thesis card in the context of the app. It makes the debate so
Mhm.
easy. Yeah, absolutely.
And another thing that I think was like very, very, I think like that I'm proud of that I came up with for that K is obviously, people are going to read ontology answers. Like, what do you do when you see a K you don't understand? You read ontology answers. So the thesis of the K, it was like, it said kind of two things. It said first that people aren't rigid in their behavior, right? Like in the real world, we're not perfectly rational economic actors. We have biases, we have preferences. You can't just apply like a utility maximization function to say what your average consumer would do. And the second thing that the K said was essentially induction fails. Right? That you cannot use like previous examples of economic theories being proven right to extrapolate that these theories are true forever into the
Just the
future.
same warrant as the first one because like emotions and stuff like shape
Well, it's kind of
outcomes.
well, yeah, well, it was like more so like this kind of separate like induction, like it was just induction fails in like applied to like economics, right? So
But was
like
there
just
like a
because
specific warrant based on colonialism?
nah, not really.
Okay,
But
fair enough, fair enough.
the reason I think that this like specific set of warrants was so persuasive is, ask yourself, what do 1AR ontology cards say? 1AR answers to ontology. Well, the first thing they say is that you can't use previous examples of racism or previous examples or X or Y or Z, to predict the future. Just because racism
Right.
occurred in the past doesn't mean it will happen, again for all of time. And the second thing that these cards say is that people are malleable, drives are malleable. We
Nice,
change
exactly.
in reaction to institutional factors. We're not like rigid or ontological. So essentially what would happen is people would just like read these ontology cards, we'd be like, concede both of them, they supercharge like the warrants for why economic rationality is bad. Like shit, like you're cooked.
I don't
So
know. That sounds like defense to me, but I do like the interaction.
yeah. I mean,
I
that's
like
like
that.
the first part of it was like certainly defensive. It's like the presumption type argument. And
Yeah.
then the link argument was offense. It said that, it was like, like a lash out type argument
Yeah.
that people will like forcefully mold the future to retroactively make it seem like their economic predictions worked.
Oh, that's
That like,
interesting.
turn
I like
case,
that.
we
Yeah.
we get like the economy on a roller coaster ride because the Fed will like drop rates or raise them to say that we've hit inflation goals, and then they post facto attribute that to some other policy and be like, "Hey, man, economic predictions worked. We're goaded. Everyone's rational. Trust me." And that produced like a bunch of external impacts as well.
That's really interesting. I like that. I really like the application of the induction fail stuff there, and just that double
Mhm.
bind with solvency. It's that's cool. So, what got you into settler colonialism? Because that was one of the
Oh,
first cases I got really into. I got like big into anthro, and then someone got me really into Tuck and Yang in like 2013. Actually, as an answer to Afro-pessimism at the time, which is like not a great
mm.
answer, not the best interaction. But that was the first kind of my first interaction to it. What got you into it?
I feel like I'm not very like it's not that I'm attached to the particular lit base per se. It just so happens that a lot of people write about it.
Yeah.
And because it's so broad, there's a lot of contextual applications of it. Like you can spin it in a lot of ways to talk about, military presence, living wage, fiscal redistribution,
Well, and just
the
the
IP.
context of Australia, Israel, and the United States and Canada are all so different that there are a lot of issues that arise. And then you can have like kind of different contextual approaches to settler colonialism in very different
Mhm.
contexts. Yeah. No,
Yeah.
it's very interesting literature to me. That's cool. So what other kind of K literatures do you find interesting? Are you into high theory or is it more the like structural colonialism, mass superstructure kind of stuff?
I mean, this is going to sound ironic to everything I've been saying so far, but I've never read a book for like any lit base at all. And the way I approach like constructing my case is less so, I look at a lit base that I think is cool or I think is interesting, and I derive an argument from there. It's more so that, I look at the topic, I'm like, okay, like here is what a winning 2NR needs, either in terms of the framework debate or like here's what a link would need to say to, turn hypothetical AF scenarios. Here's what an alt would need to do to solve them. And then once I have that kind of in my head, I go and I do research until I find cards that make those arguments for me. So it's really just like, whatever is the first lit base that comes up. It doesn't matter if it's like, anti-blackness, Baudrillard, cybernetics, settler colonialism, whatever ticks those boxes, I'll cut. So I don't really have a lot of like super in-depth knowledge on a lot of these things. Insofar as like, I couldn't explain to you how like, the Australian like version of set call
Yeah.
or versus like the Israeli like the Puar stuff about like Palestine and colonization. I couldn't really explain the intricacies or the differences. But I guess
But you
that's
put a
definitely
lot of
something.
moving parts.
Yeah. It's more so
Fair
just like
enough.
I can give you like a bunch of cherry-picked examples. Like here's why this topic was racist according to,
Yeah.
settler colonialism. Yeah.
I'm 15 years in, and I love reading, so I've
Hmm.
got very into a lot of the books and a lot of literature. But I like that approach though. I tend to. This is something I tell kids a lot. They ask me what K they should read, and I was like, I don't know, what's the topic, right? Like
Yeah,
I feel
exactly. Yeah.
like, yeah, like it should be something that affirms or negates on the resolution, right? No,
Hmm.
absolutely. So that's cool. That's cool. So what other Ks have you gone into? Have you learned a lot of like Baudrillard, any of the like tech management stuff, psycho? What do you kind of like?
I
Or
mean,
don't like AS.
now that I think about it, I definitely have been on a sort of set cult craze recently, or for the
Yeah.
majority of my career, which I guess is why you asked the question.
Well, that's
I have
good.
some
I have
like,
100 links if you want. So if we combine our links, we'll probably at like 200. Although I
yeah,
imagine
bet.
that's redundant.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I've been looking at the topic list, and it seems like either it's just going to be like Kant or set call will certainly work out. But I
Yeah.
definitely, kind of want to branch out. Something actually that I've been interested in exploring is like Buddhism, in the sense that there seems to be like a lot of, again, thesis claims that can be applied very strategically to debate, i.e., they have a K of like linear predictions that can be
Right.
used on
That's
like
what
IR
that's
topics.
my favorite part of it is the critique of like, yeah, Cartesian linear predictions. So interesting to
Hmm
me. Yeah.
hmm
I really
And
like the interactions between like anthro-tech management and Buddhism and just like kind of all that. Yeah, I think that stuff is ripe for interrogation. Yeah.
yeah, I mean, we just have to see like, what I guess the community votes on for September, October.
Yeah, what are
Um,
the options? I haven't even looked if I'm being
I don't
honest.
remember them off the top of my head, but I remember most of them just like have the words like is immoral in the
Yeah.
the text of them. So I mean,
So
I don't know how
Nietzsche
that's gonna
every
look.
round.
Yeah,
That's gonna look,
pretty much.
it's gonna make Phil debaters have a lot of fun, I'm guessing. People are gonna have to actually learn how to answer skep, maybe. I don't know. We'll see.
Well, I don't know if that's possible, but
Right.
they certainly will
I actually
try.
we were talking about moral theory today. I was teaching PFers meta ethics, so they had a lot of fun with that. And yeah, we ended up talking about skep for a good 20 minutes, and they were all like, "I just don't understand. Like, how this is so stupid." And I was like, "Man, tell me about it." It's funny when you like actually study philosophy and they just like kind of move past skep pretty quickly. They're like, "Ah, yeah, sure, maybe we can't. I don't know. We'll move on. Let's have a real discussion. Any
Yeah.
debate? No, skep every round." That's awesome. Well, it was good to meet you, man. It was good to talk to you a little bit more. Obviously, we've met a couple times, but I wanted to sit down and pick your brain a little bit on K's. Do you have any
Mhm.
questions for me? No is a perfectly fine answer. I'm a boomer, and my opinions are kind of silly at this point.
I guess I did have a question actually. You mentioned you read a lot. What would you
Yeah,
say your favorite book is? Or I mean, it might be hard to choose one,
yeah.
but at the
No,
very
no,
least,
no.
like,
That's
what is
that's
like a
very
top read?
yeah. So I would say, obviously, like what kind of book I would recommend would be like genre dependent, right? Like if you're asking me for something like a stupid Star Wars book, I might have an opinion on that, or like a lit
Hmm
RPG. But I'm assuming you're talking more like nonfiction, right?
Yeah, or
So I
like
got
debate tangential.
yeah, exactly. So I got my master's degree in applied economics, and so
Oh,
to
wow.
me, trying to like create systems in the world is a very interesting way of like approaching knowledge production. And so I was fascinated by guns, germs, and steel. I read that in human geography, AP Human in like ninth grade, but I revisited it maybe 2 summers ago. When I was building something in the garage, and just fascinating look at like geographic determinism and how the kind of like literal physical features of a continent, the shape of a continent, the width, depth, all that kind of stuff, how that shapes like outcomes for civilizations, how it shapes parameters for tech. I thought like a really interesting one is like Europe be having a lot of boundaries, like water boundaries. That means there's a lot more countries, so there's a lot more warfare that happens over time than in like bigger places with less kind of boundaries, or proximity to herd animals, or do those herd animals have milk? How does that relate to the proximity that somebody lives within them to how likely they are to like be resistant to diseases. I don't know. I thought that that book was very, very interesting. I tend to somewhat agree with like the criticisms of it being like a little totalizing in terms of like how much it predetermines geography as an outcome for like social forces. But it was definitely an really interesting way of looking at the world. Another one I thought that was like kind of related was oh, what is it called? It's like Principles of a Changing World Order or something like that by Ray Dalio. He's like a billionaire investor, like uber cap kind of guy. But I did think it was really interesting because it was like an evaluation of like the past six great powers and the kind of like structural factors that led to their rise and fall. A lot of it was kind of like a story told through the global reserve currency. And it's just like really interesting looking at like large structural historical factors and then kind of like viewing them in the context of where we're at today, right? I think it's very interesting to kind of like look at what are we going to think about in 30 years? What kind of like part of history are we going to be in the history book, right? And so I like these kind of like big grand narrative kind of approaches to studying human history. Yeah, I'm big into reading about revolutions generally.
Mm.
I think it's really interesting to learn about why systems fall apart. What actually like causes somebody to be so desperate that they're out in the streets. I don't know. That's like fascinating to me as somebody who clearly lives in a stable country in the West. It's very interesting what would lead someone to run into a gun being fired at them. I find all that just like absolutely fascinating. Yeah, I've gotten out of reading philosophy as much recently. I think like
Mm.
5, 8 years ago, I loved reading, any existentialist or random postmodern lit. But yeah, these days I just kind of like history and especially history that allows me to like kind of reckon with where we're at in the world as it is now. A lot of like the fall of democracy books are kind of interesting, that kind of stuff.
Hmm.
If you ever want a book, just text me. I have like a list of
Yeah, for
100 of
sure.
them.
That sounds very interesting, actually. I might, DM you after this,
Yeah,
to get a
absolutely.
more cohesive list.
Cool. Well, it was good talking to you. Obviously, if you
Yeah,
need
thanks for
anything,
having me.
next time, what should we talk about? Let's make a commitment on air so that we're bound by our 6 viewers.
Oh, sure. I mean, we can kind of dive more deeply into K framework, like
Okay.
mechanics, af, neg, what I
Yeah.
think personally
I
are
definitely
winning,
think
losing
like going
arguments.
through what you were talking about too, with like what an actual proper answer to a K looks like. The kind
Yeah,
of skills of how to go for the perm double bind, that kind of stuff. Yeah.
yeah,
That'd be- All right, cool. Well, it was good talking to you. I hope you have a
of
good night.
course.
I'm gonna end the
Thanks, you
recording
too.
now. Goodbye, audience.